Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is an overview for the remainder of the course. But before we get to that, I have a point that I should have made last time. So you remember this graph of the number of ongoing civil wars, the average length of ongoing civil wars, and the number of new civil wars occurring from 1945 to 2000. Well, if you take that dark red line at the bottom and you sum up the number of new civil wars in each year over the period, you see that there were about 125 of them. If you look at the number of interstate wars that started over the period that aren't on this graph, you'd only get about 25 of those, which means there were roughly 5 times as many civil wars going on over this period than there were interstate wars. So, in turn, if you're interested in studying warfare and you're only looking at interstate wars, you are missing out on a vast majority of the total possible cases. So, to bottom line it, if you're interested in studying warfare, you have to be interested in studying civil wars as a result. Okay, I should have made that point last time. Apologies for that. Let's get to the overview. This course has 3 units. We're going to start off with a unit on bargaining, then we'll transition into coercion, meddling, and intervention, and then we'll conclude with a unit on terrorism and insurgency. Why are we starting off with bargaining? Well, you can think of this as the background unit. Wars occur as the result of bargaining failure. If we're fighting a war, it's because the rebel group and the government were unable to sit down at the bargaining table and negotiate an agreement that would avoid all that bloodshed, murder, and destruction. So if you are a third-party actor that wants to involve itself in a civil war, before you can do that, if you're going to be doing it intelligently, you need to understand why bargaining failed in the first place. So as a result, we're starting off with a unit on bargaining so we understand why civil wars occur. So then in the second unit, we can say intelligent things about how to alter preferences in regards to the fight. And when we get to that, we'll see a unit on coercion and meddling and intervention. So again, we're thinking about this in terms of third-party actors like the United States and the United Nations doing various things to affect civil war outcomes. So for example, the United States might levy sanctions against a government to try to get the government to sit down at the bargaining table with a rebel group and negotiate an agreement and avoid further bloodshed. Do those sorts of sanctions even work? We'll talk about that. Does the United Nations do anything useful? The United Nations will often come up with various resolutions condemning actions within a civil war and also send out peacekeepers to try to establish peace in a troubled region. And we'll talk about whether the United Nations can be effective in those actions. We're going to talk about whether there's a normative responsibility to protect innocents. Do big, strong governments like the United States have a responsibility to protect individuals, weak parties in third world countries from oppressive dictatorships? We'll talk about that. And we'll also talk about whether intervention can even work. This might be an important point if you're living in the United States and over the last decade or so, you've seen a couple of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq not turn out so well. So we'll talk about that. And then in the last unit, we'll cover terrorism and insurgency. These are mostly going to be basic points. We're going to start off with asking basic questions like, what's the point of terrorism and can it even be effective? And when we talk about insurgencies, we're going to talk about how that's substantially different than a standard civil war. So in your basic civil war, you have a rebel group and a government. You have both of them having armies, and you have both of them fighting a conflict against each other. In an insurgency, while that's still a civil war, it's slightly different in the sense that the rebel groups don't really want to actively be involved in a fight, and they would rather actively avoid fighting and essentially play the long game. So we'll talk about how that strategy occurs, and we'll also talk about how counterinsurgency operations can counteract those strategies. Overall, during this course, we're going to see a main general theme, which is that civil wars are not fought in a vacuum. So if you're a rebel group and you're thinking about whether to start a revolution or not, you need to understand and anticipate how third parties like the United States are going to respond to that. Is the United States going to be really excited and give you military support in fighting your revolution? Well, in that case, you might be more likely to start the war. If the United States is going to be helping out the government, well, that might make you less likely to start the war. And if the United States is not going to be responding to you very kindly if you do win the war ultimately, if they're not actually going to be, say, providing you with economic aid to rebuild your country, again, you might not want to fight the war. So in general here, the big theme for this course is that civil wars are not fought in a vacuum. in terms of how I'm going to be teaching this course, I'm going to be emphasizing strategy. War is a very strategic thing in terms of both negotiations and tactics within the conflict. So if nothing else, in this class, you will learn how to think strategically. What I am not going to be doing at all is reciting Wikipedia to you. A lot of courses will just essentially take a Wikipedia page on the Korean War or any other civil war, the Libyan Civil War, and they will give you a bunch of slides on what happened during that civil war. I am not going to be doing that at all. And the reason for that is that if you want to learn those things, you can do that by going to Wikipedia and reading. There is no point in me doing a Wikipedia page in a slideshow presentation. I want to give you value added. I want to teach you something. And what I'm going to be teaching you is how to think strategically about war. That is the point of this class. And lastly, just to briefly talk about prerequisites, in theory, there are no prerequisites for this class. However, both Game Theory 101 and International Relations 101 would be useful if you've taken those classes before. They are available online on this channel, so if you want to check those out, wouldn't be a bad idea. Game Theory 101 is useful because bargaining essentially relies on game theory to understand basic bargaining theory, so it would help to have a game theory background. If you don't, that's fine, no big deal. And a lot of the themes that we'll be seeing here in talking about how third parties interact with civil wars, well, that's going to be essentially looking at international relations. So having taken International Relations 101 would also be useful. And actually, for full honesty and full disclosure, when I teach this class in real life, it's an upper division class in an international relations department. So the people who are taking this class in real life have taken International Relations 101 or whatever the equivalent is before they take this class. So it wouldn't hurt you to take International Relations 101 before this, but I'm assuming that you don't know anything about essentially any of those topics beforehand. So if you haven't taken those classes, no big deal. That wraps up this overview of this course, and in the next section, we're going to begin our unit on bargaining. Join me then.